A warm welcome.
So, Philip, we are back. Last May we were in London doing virtually the same session.
As a double act.
Indeed, indeed. And if it was a huge hit, and it was a hit today, we could make it a traveling act. Okay? And,
I've stopped going on tour.
Indeed, indeed. And Philip regaled everybody with this treasure house of Beatles anecdotes. It's amazing what this man knows about the Beatles. But before I turn to Philip, let me sort of say a little bit about the Beatles in India, or India and the Beatles. When I did this session in London, I was beginning to research my book. And I was, of course, a big fan. And I was writing the book as a Beatles fan and not a Beatles expert like Philip, who's a Beatles expert. I'm basically a political commentator. But I, in my research, found some incredible Beatles fans, including a lady who was a teenager when the Beatles first came to India in 1966. And she met John Lennon. Didn't really meet John Lennon, but John Lennon was outside the Oberoi Hotel in his black Mercedes car. The window came down and John wound in her life. And can you believe it? This wound developed a scab and she preserved the scab for many years till it was thrown away by mistake because she felt it belonged to a museum. So that kind of crazy Beatle mania was there even in India as well. And I remember I fell in love with the Beatles as a teenage rebel in Calcutta. And my father hated the Beatles. He really hated the Beatles because he didn't like their music, but most of all, he hated the length of their hair. And I think one of the biggest fights I've had in my life is this growing hair as long as the Beatles, which was an obsession. But it was incredible. I remember in Calcutta, the Statesman, which was this Bible of the Bengali Bhadralok, the Bengali gentlefolk, and my father really believed in Statesman. When the Junior Statesman came out, and on their first issue they put the Beatles, it was a huge victory for us because the Beatles were, had to be accepted. But, it's something which the Beatles really captured the imagination in India. It completely changed and transformed rock and roll bands who earlier used to play Elvis Presley and Cliff Richards and Ricky Nelson, the whole crooner concept, and the Beatles changed all that. In Bangalore, in Calcutta, in Bombay, in all the major cities, rock music was introduced by the Beatles, in India, and they had, a huge fan club. But then there were others who didn't like the Beatles all that much, because when the Beatles came to India at Rishikesh to Mahesh Yogi's ashram, many people have forgotten, or many people do not know, there was such a huge controversy in Parliament. The leftist, the communist and the socialist opposition was up in arms. They said that these were CIA spies, and the Maharishi was running a CIA racket. And mind you, the local police even discovered a man called Russell Brines, who the police said may have been a CIA agent, which fueled the controversy further in Parliament. And it was quite amazing. I mean, to think about this whole CIA controversy. And funnily enough, soon after, the Soviet Union sent one of their top spies in India to the Maharishi, a chap called Bezmenov, who later defected to Canada, and who told this story, amazing story about how he met the Maharishi And he was sent by the Soviet Union because the Beatles came to Rishikesh, and that was this huge sort of, whole world was looking at the Beatles in India. I mean, we forget that 50 years ago, Beatles coming to India was such a big event.
Just to add a footnote to your hair story, the Rolling Stones came along 6 months or so after the Beatles broke through, and their hair actually curled over their collars. And newspaper editorials started saying, why can't they have their hair nice and short like the Beatles? And the weird thing was that the Stones were marketed as the sort of the anti-Beatles. The Beatles were cuddly and the Stones were horrible roughnecks. In fact, the Stones had started out as very nice lads from the southern Kentish suburbs who wanted to play the blues. The Beatles had had a very seedy history in Hamburg and in Liverpool, and they switched characters. So the Beatles became cuddly and the Stones became wicked. It was really the other way around.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting about, length of hair, how important it was. But, the people who disliked the Beatles, there was an entire debate going on between traditionalists in India, and they were very unhappy because one of India's major cultural stars, Pandit Ravi Shankar, was George Harrison's guru. And there was a feeling that Ravi Shankar had been stolen by the Beatles, had been stolen by the West, that he had become a hippie and he was destroying his own music. And there were lots, the huge, vicious propaganda campaign against Ravi Shankar. And Ravi Shankar was very deeply hurt because, he of course was true to his music, but Ravi Shankar being Ravi Shankar, and because of his closeness to George Harrison, he spent all this time, actually starting the sitar craze, and there was this huge craze, not just with the Beatles, but several other sort of rock bands.
And Indian music. In fact, Ravi Shankar was suddenly worshipped like a pop star in London. And when he gave a concert at the Royal Albert Hall, he and his musicians tuned up for 20 minutes before the concert, and he got a huge round of applause.
And finally, before I turn to Philip and ask him some questions, what struck me during my research is the eerie hand of destiny, which seemed to have worked, in bringing the Beatles to India, because, George Harrison picks up the sitar on the sets of Help. And the Help, mind you, was a completely wacky spoof, poking fun at everything, but it was entirely inappropriate as far as Indian culture is concerned. I can assure you, Help may have been banned here because, the kind of racial stereotypes it built up. It still had this whole thing. But George picked up the sitar at this Indian restaurant just out of curiosity. It was the sets of an Indian restaurant at Twickenham Studios. And, if you look at it, even 2 months ago, 2 months before that, at the Bahamas, they were still shooting for Help. An Indian guru comes on his cycle and gives them a book of yoga and spirituality. Now, what are the chances of that? It was just incredible. And then George, after sort of buying a cheap sitar on Oxford Street, is recording Norwegian Wood when his sitar string snaps. And they have to get a replacement for that. And they get in touch with the Asian Musical Circle in London. And that introduces George to the Angadis, who in turn introduces him to Ravi Shankar. And that changes, their relationship with India completely. Patty Harrison's sudden decision to attend transcendental meditation classes. That was also a curious sort of coincidence. And, it's quite amazing that Maharishi visits London just around that time. And they all decide to go and hear the Maharishi. But I think the biggest twist of fate of all is Brian Epstein's death while they're at Bangor, Wales, getting initiated into the secret mantra. It's quite amazing because this was their mentor, who was their father figure in their lives, and they're taking a new guru, and it all happens together. So it's a very strange type of hand of fate, as it were, which brought the Beatles to India. But we'll ask Philip a couple of questions on the Beatles and India. And we discussed in London how the craze in the West in the 1960s about Eastern mysticism and Indian spirituality played its part in bringing the Beatles to India, which in turn brought Indian religion and culture even closer to the Western audience. And how the quest for eternal happiness through a magical mantra by the Beatles and other celebrities as well at Maharishi's ashram may have been partly an escape from consumerist society in the West, an overdose of experimental drugs, and there was a lot floating around at that time. And as you pointed out, probably just the need of a vacation for some of the members of the band, because they were so knackered out. But, but Philip, if I could complete the question.
I'm sorry, the boxcar hit me in the side of the head. I thought the train had passed.
Yeah, no, but don't you feel, as an add-on to what we discussed in London, don't you feel that the India trip and the India fixation, as it were, the Beatles, was also a part of the Beatles trying to reinvent themselves, from the mid-60s?
They were trying to reinvent themselves, but simultaneously as meditators and also businessmen. So it was Krishna and Mammon at the same time, because they were setting up their Apple organization, which was partly philanthropic and partly business. But they also had this strange sensation of discovering that being very rich and very famous and adulated all over the world somehow wasn't quite enough. Something else to life must exist. And they turned to the Maharishi. Now, the Maharishi had been coming to London for years and years and years. His picture on the London Underground wall was almost as familiar as Way Out. It was really, really a tradition that he came to London, and no one associated him with anything glamorous until the Beatles decided, as a group, to go and hear him give a lecture. And they decided everything in a group in those days. There was a thing called the group mind, where if one of them did something, the others supported him. So when Paul McCartney fell off his motor scooter in Liverpool and cut his lip and grew a moustache to hide the scar, they all grew moustaches. When one of them decided to try meditation, they all decided to try meditation, with different degrees of success, and in the case of George, with lasting effect. But it was really, firstly, always the quest for something new, something different, and something that might be on a little higher level than just smoking pot and wearing shirts and going to Carnaby Street. And that was how it came about that they went. But as you said, Ajoy, they had not had a break from being the Beatles for 4 or 5 years. They had been kept on a punishing schedule of recording and touring and making personal appearances, which they never ever objected to. They did exactly what they were told. Because they were told, make the most of this while it's going, this success, because it may be all over in 6 months. I mean, that was a great prophecy, of course. And so they kept working and going to Rishikesh and being with the Maharishi. And it was a very mild regimen. They were told they only had to meditate for half an hour a day. It was like a fast track to divinity, if you like. And so that was irresistible. But it was just the break, the getting away from the terrible responsibility and pressure of being the Beatles that drove them there.
Several years before they met the Maharishi, actually 2 years before, Ravi Shankar played a huge role. First in, of course, bringing George Harrison to India on that amazing cultural odyssey he took George and Patty through. And in fact, when I spoke to Patty in London, it was quite amazing to hear from her that the memories of the trip she took with George across India seemed to be more vivid than the Rishikesh ashram trip. And it's quite amazing because they went across India. They went to Srinagar, and they lived on a houseboat on the Dal Lake. They went to Ajanta and Ellora, where Patty was amazed to see naked Hindu goddesses, worshipped in a temple. They went to Benares, which was this huge, created a huge impact on Patty because, she saw people being burnt on the ghats. And just above that, there was this bustling markets, this whole relationship between life and death. And then, of course, Ravi Shankar even took them to his own guru, the Tat Baba. And that itself, to see George's guru behave like an absolute child in front of his guru, was something which was quite. And she just got married to, George. And I mean, they never really were out of England, in that cultural sense. And it was a complete, and that is what I think really deepened George's connection with India. But what really strikes me, and Philip, maybe you could answer this, although Ravi Shankar was quite ready to have collaborations with Western classical musicians, with jazz musicians, he didn't show much interest in doing any collaborations with rock musicians, the Beatles or any other group. What do you think was that? I mean,
well, don't forget, the sitar was not a stranger to the British pop charts when the Beatles, when George discovered it. The Stones actually had used the sitar, and the Kinks had used the sitar, but not in any sort of spiritual sense. There was a ridiculous song by the Stones called Mother's Little Helper, which is about housewives taking pills, which has a sitar on it. There's the Kinks' See My Friend, has a really weird, great sounding sitar, but there was no connection with the culture. It was just a novelty. And I think the important thing to remember with George, there was obviously a spirituality about George. There was a desire, a hunger to learn things which he had never actually felt when he was at school. He was at the same school as Paul McCartney, as you know. But George was, in the Beatles, he was the underdog. It was a two-tier band. There were the aspirant middle class, John and Paul, and there were the very much more blue-collar, George and Ringo. And George felt always, and how you could feel slighted as a Beatle, quite honestly escapes me, but he did. And as soon as he got the sitar and he was connected to Ravi Shankar, he could bring sitars and musicians into the studio. That was a source of new influence for George. That gave him a foothold in the band that he really hadn't had before. But of course, it was more than that, and it became much more deep-rooted with him. Ajoy was saying yesterday, and perhaps you've thought the same, that these sort of ordinary lads from Liverpool, it was a great leap for them to decide that they wanted to embrace Indian culture and Indian music. But in fact, they were always very open to quite avant-garde influences, even in Liverpool. John Lennon, who always pretended to be such a hopeless scholar at school, in fact was a brilliant scholar. Some of his school books used to be taken by the teachers and shown to other classes, an example of great work. McCartney as well was very, very bright. He decided to leave school and go to Hamburg and play in a band called the Beatles instead of taking his A-levels. He could have taken his A-levels and become a very good English teacher. So they were not dumb, these boys. Ringo perhaps did not have the same level of spirituality, but the group mind swept Ringo up, and so Ringo went off to Rishikesh as well, so afraid of the food that he took a case of baked beans with him. And when the baked beans were finished, then Ringo went home, unfortunately.
Don't forget the insects.
It was his wife, Maureen, who liked the insects. Yeah. But of course, they were Beatles.
You know, the relationship between Mahesh Yogi, the Maharishi, and the Beatles is a very interesting relationship because obviously in the beginning they were all very, very impressed. I mean, not just George, but John as well. And if you hear Paul, after his first encounters with the Maharishi, he's gushing about the Maharishi.
Well, Paul was meditating before he met.
Yes, so, but he was really, really impressed, even with the sort of initiation ceremony. And even poor Ringo was, also saying that, this was completely something new in his life, and he felt that he would learn a lot from the Maharishi. But it didn't take long before things went wrong, in the sense that this whole almost like a play, which sort of was enacted at the ashram and ending in this complete chaotic departure of George and John saying some very ugly things to the Maharishi. What was this relationship, this whole guru relationship? I mean, what firstly drove them to have a guru, and secondly, what sort of snapped it?
Well, the crucial thing is something you've mentioned, which was the death of Brian Epstein, their manager, who was more than a manager. He was like a parent. He was gay. You couldn't be gay in Britain at that time. He was in love with John Lennon, but he was in love with the Beatles, and the Beatles were like his children. They really were. He died very suddenly, very tragically, while they were on this weekend course, this meditation, kind of induction course. And the Maharishi said things to them which were very, very good about the unimportance of death, about having to feel positive and remember the good about Brian. And that was, very, very crucial in bringing them to the Maharishi. They said they would meditate. They didn't. They delayed a long time before they went to Rishikesh. And they were simultaneously, as I said, setting up their Apple organization. But unfortunately, behind the wire, as they put it, about the ashram, Beatle politics start. The Beatles, each one of them was like Louis XIV with his own little court, his own little clique. And politics started going, and there were other people there. Other people from the rock world were there too. And there were rumors started about the Maharishi, against whom nothing was ever known, really negative. He was quite businesslike. That was the worst you could say, really. And of course, also the attention span of a Beatle was terribly short. And John thought the Maharishi was going to tell him the secret of life in the first 48 hours.
In the helicopter.
The Maharishi had a helicopter. And John said to Paul, there was one ride on offer in the helicopter. And John said to Paul, I think I'll go up in the helicopter with the Maharishi. You might tell me the secret of life. And of course, he didn't get to hear the secret of life. And in the end, the attention span started to wane, and these rumors about the Maharishi's sexual peccadillos, which were never, ever proved in any way at all. And so it came to a rather sad ending. Whereas, of course, the trip with George and his wife Patty was private and leisurely, and of course was much more valuable to George.
No, I mean, in my conversation with Patty feels that this whole role which the Greek magic Alex Mardas, whom you described in your book as John introducing Mardas as his guru, because he used to do sort of funny little inventions for them. And then, of course, he tried to help them buy a Greek island. Patty felt that actually maybe Alex Mardas, who was a slightly dubious character, she admitted, but it was John really who was very keen to get back to London to be with Yoko Ono. And he was really smitten by Yoko. But what I'm really sort of intrigued, why George went along? Because, I mean, George obviously would have been uncomfortable at this very ugly departure. And John, I mean, in his little version of what happened, said he changed his mind about all these rumors about Maharishi's sexual adventures, because George also started believing it. I mean, what really happened? Why did George go along?
It's a mystery, really, because it was with George that this whole experience took such root. And he was very, very faithful to the TM movement for years and years afterwards. Again, you have to say the group mind somehow operates here. And when somebody wants to do something, the others went along with it. I think the Maharishis had a very, very bad deal. In fact, Magic Alex, he was supposed to be a son of one of the Greek colonels that had taken over Greece at the time, and also somehow related to the Aga Khan. He was related to everybody in the world, actually. And he did have some very funny ideas, one of which was a house that sat on a force field like a hovercraft, so your house floated. But then he also had the idea for early mobile phones and video phones. Some of his ideas were very good. But there was always somebody whispering in one of their ears. They were also being courted. This is the weirdest thing for me. While they were at Rishikesh, one of their Apple executives came out and tried to interest them in making the first film of The Hobbit by J.R. Tolkien.
Yes.
And they were all reading scripts where John would be Gandalf and Paul would be Gollum and everybody. This is going on while they're also meditating and they're listening to these nasty rumors. I mean, it was completely sort of, divided state of mind that they were in. But mainly as well, as you say, John was getting these letters. They only had letters in those days from Yoko.
Postcards.
Postcards or letters with one word written on them. But the postcards were always in a brown envelope, like a piece of pornography, and the one word would be breathe.
Or
John,
look at the clouds, I'm there.
I'm there, yes. Well,
it's quite amazing, really.
Yes. I mean, John wanted to take her as well, but realized the group mind wouldn't go along with that at all.
I think everybody would have thrown a fit.
Yeah.
Despite their experiments with transcendental meditation and the way it ended, and clearly the dissensions within the group, the way, and what really struck me was, and I didn't know this, that how much both John and George had started loathing being a Beatle. I mean, being stifled as a Beatle, and yet, despite all their dissensions, and despite the way the group was going, they produced some incredible music while going down. I mean, that is what makes the Beatles such a special band, because if you look at around that period with the White Album and then its aftermath, they produced this incredible creative burst, firstly producing so many songs at Rishikesh, and even after that recording so many. I mean, what was so unique about this group?
Well, of course, yes, as you say, they carried on writing songs at Rishikesh for the White Album, which their producer George Martin always tried to stop them making into a double album. If they made it into a single album, Martin said it would have been magnificent. It was very diffuse and very sort of piecemeal, but with wonderful stuff on it. Mostly from John, actually, more than Paul on that album. And it was the tension within them that created the genius. If you listen to the John Lennon, Paul McCartney harmony, it is total opposites making harmony. And the tension is wonderful. And John, however much he said he hated Paul's more sentimental music, when John did a vocal on Lovely Rita,
it's amazing,
on Sgt. Pepper, John actually ties the whole thing together. It's only really a concept album because of John's background vocal.
Day in the Life.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a little bit of, the Day in the Life, which is like John, it's like De Profundis, it's like Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, from the depths of John's despair and boredom, frustration. And in the middle, there's a little cheerful bit by Paul, about catching a bus, got up, walk out of bed. The song would not be the song it is without that little cheery bit in the middle. It was always the tension between them. But you're absolutely right. George was very sickened by the sort of the hysteria, because they would be playing For years and years, they would play and not be able to hear themselves because of the screaming. They didn't know, they could do whatever they liked. John would crash his arm on his keyboard. Nobody would know he'd done it. John was always looking for a way out from about 1965. But for John, Yoko was the way out. For George, it was India.
You know, Rishikesh, as you said, was partly a vacation for them, partly to break the shackles of stardom, partly to discover what they were as individuals, not just as a band. For the first time, they were thinking of themselves, as people, not really as a band. And they had time and space. I mean, it was just a physical relocation where they were, you know, near a forest, completely way away from, you know, their sort of usual habitat. But do you feel that because of this, they started unraveling as a band? Meaning, I mean, it's true that they were moving towards this denouement, moving towards this unraveling in any case. But did Rishikesh act as a catalyst for the Beatles' breakup just a few years later?
No, I think it actually delayed it. Because as soon as Brian Epstein wasn't there, Brian made this protective wall around them. He shielded them from the world, in the end to the expense of his own life. And once his protection wasn't there, they knew really that they were finished. John said when he heard that Brian was dead, that's it, it's over. And in fact, Rishikesh was a sort of, you know, an interlude of a bit of taking stock, as you say. And they went back and they went into this business enterprise, which was a total disaster. Total disaster. It was a cross between a sort of an early Habitat Conran store and an alternative arts council. So they said they would give money to any young performers who had not been recognized and were finding it to struggle the way that the Beatles had had to struggle. The Beatles didn't have to struggle. The Beatles found Brian Epstein, and then the Beatles found George Martin, and then even the Beatles found Dick James. These are basically honest men. The greatest band in the history of bands is run by three honest men. What are the chances of that? So but Brian protected them. Brian treated them like his children. Brian loved them like his children. And once that wasn't there, however much John used to make, he adored John is what it was. And he was slightly uncomfortable with Paul, and the other two he just treated as someone put it to me, Ringo was the runt of the litter, the adorable runt of the litter. And George was the quiet one, didn't make much trouble. But it was really all about John.
Absolutely. And John was feeling quite suicidal in those days. And, you know, so I remember reading somewhere that if it hadn't been for Maharishi, and if it hadn't been for this, you know, you could have one of the first, you know, big suicides, you know, before Janis Joplin, before, you know. So, I mean, you know, John was writing suicidal songs.
He was. I think at the last minute, John's sense of humour would have saved him from pulling the trigger.
Yes.
Yes. But John wrote a song called Help in 1965. It came out in 65.
Yeah.
You know, the Beatles could transform any lyric into total happiness. When you remember, they once recorded something called I'm a Loser. Made it sound so happy. Yes, absolutely. Whatever they sang was okay, up to a point, until John starts, you know, I am the walrus. And John really, from the moment the screaming started, or really perhaps from the moment they even couldn't wear their black leather suits anymore, John felt they were selling out, and John wasn't happy, because John wasn't just a musician. John always felt Paul was the tunesmith, and John was the rocker. In fact, Paul was a very, very good rocker, and John was a very good tunesmith. The other thing about the two of them is that they were absolutely, although different characters, symbiotic creatively. So if one started writing a song, couldn't finish it, the other one would finish the song.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Mick Jagger's called them the four-headed monster.
That's right.
I mean, it's amazing.
For me, the metaphor that sums it up is that As you all know, Paul was left-handed as a guitarist and bass player. John was right-handed. But Paul could play John's right-handed and John could play Paul's left-handed. And they could swap creative spirits in exactly the same way. And of course, they both, extraordinary for a songwriting team, they both wrote words and they both wrote music. That is virtually unique in the history of major songwriting teams.
Finally, Philip, you know, it's amazing to think that 50 years after, we're still, you know, having sessions on the Beatles. What is it? What is it, I mean, about this band, you know, which makes it so evergreen? Why is it that the saga of the Beatles, the legacy of the Beatles, the memory of the Beatles continues after so long?
Well, their great publicist, Derek Taylor, who in his way was celebrated as a Beatle. Only the Beatles could have a publicist who would be celebrated like a Beatle, and whom journalists loved as much as they loved the Beatles. He called the story of the Beatles the 20th century's greatest romance, which it is. And in fact, the quality that they have, apart from the genius of the songwriting, is what is supposed to be the most fatal thing about the English, according to Evelyn Waugh in Brideshead Revisited: creamy English charm. And what gets a young kid today in any part of the world is the charm and the capacity to create joy. I think they are the greatest engine for creating human happiness the modern world has seen. And that doesn't... People used to think when Alan Klein, their last manager, was terrified because when he becomes their manager, they're breaking up. Alan Klein thinks that's the end, they're breaking up. In a way, the end, that was just the beginning. And then when the unspeakable tragedy of John's assassination happened, that starts another wave of Beatlemania. Because for in between the breakup and the death of John, the world was still waiting for them to come back and still saying, when are you going to come back? And of course, they'd never officially broke up and they never said they were coming back. Once John wasn't there, they could never come back. And that was when the real Beatlemania started.
You know, it's quite amazing that when I went to Rishikesh some months ago in my research for the book, we found all kinds of people from all over the world and all over India, actually, you know, coming to those ruins. I mean, there's nothing much there. They are trying to build a museum, but it's really not very much there anymore. And I met this very attractive 18-year-old from Bangalore who had come and who had dragged actually her parents from their temple rounds, you know, from all over Haridwar and Rishikesh, and brought them. And her mother was saying, you know, she's sort of really keen on the Beatles, and we had to come because of her. So I asked her that, you know, the Beatles, you know, they belong to the past century. I mean, you know, what is it that, you know, makes the Beatles so special for you after all these years? She thought a little while, and then she said, you know, they appeal to my heart. And I think that is the quite amazing thing about the Beatles, that they appeal to your heart, you know, as he says, a romance. So before we throw this open to questions, even Indian politicians who don't have probably much time for, you know, the rock music, have had their moments with the Beatles, and we're going to play you a little clip showing what Mukul Sangma, the Chief Minister of Meghalaya, his ministers, and even the leader of the opposition do on a stage. So it's a very nice little clip, and in London they loved it.
I
I think we opened it to questions. Right, okay, sure. Pardon? Yes, or why don't you? I mean, that would be much, much better.
Hello.
Yeah.
In the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell,
Can you speak a little louder here?
in the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he says that Beatles practiced for 10,000 hours, and that's how slowly and gradually they became successful. 10,000 hours turned out to be, in the book, 3 hours per day, 1,000 hours per year for 10 years. So what do you have to say about that?
I think that must be a reference mostly to their time in Hamburg, in what used to be West Germany, where they went out to play in what turned out to be a strip club. They got into a slightly better club after that. And it was really human slavery. They really had to play all night with sort of 10-minute breaks. But it built them from they were not at all the best band on Merseyside when they went out. And one of the bands, Liverpool bands already in Hamburg, wrote an angry letter to the manager, Alan Williams, saying, "What are you sending those bums? The Beatles, they'll spoil it for us, you know. They're so bad." But that tremendous feat of endurance of playing in those clubs, which certainly did amount to nearly as many hours, I'm sure, if not as many, was the making of them. It also meant that they couldn't only rely on playing cover versions of other people's hits. They had to write songs to fill up these huge programs that they were having to play all night.
Very difficult
Yeah.
to swap.
Okay. Yeah, contrary to public opinion, you've written in your book, Shout, that the Beatles was really 3/4 John Lennon. Why have you made that statement? Like, do you think John Lennon was more important than the other Beatles, or what's it like?
I did say that when I wrote Shout, which, as you know, was a long, long time ago. I realized that was not a good thing to have written. I was wrong.
He reviewed it, yeah.
And indeed, McCartney, for many, many years, I was taxed with this remark. Eventually, McCartney phoned me. He said, "Hello, it's Paul here." I thought I should have said Paul who, but I didn't, of course. I just thought, I'd like to know who this guy is, doesn't like me. And I talked to him for about half an hour on the phone. And it was weird because I was not talking to him as a writer. I didn't think it was when I was going to do my John Lennon book. And I didn't think he would help me at all with the book. And I talked to him just like another bloke. And I really started to get the point of Paul as we talked. And as it turned out, he did help me on the John Lennon book by email. He wrote email answers to my questions. And when I thought that there should be a companion volume to the John Lennon biography, McCartney gave me his tacit consent and help to do that. And that biography, Paul McCartney, which I'm hoping is at the festival where you could buy, is really an effort to make amends for that really stupid comment in Shout, which I withdraw.
I mean, and if I may add that Philip is one of the very few people who had the courage to review his earlier analysis. And it's something which it strikes you, when you research a book on the Beatles, how important the role which Paul played, because John and George had their own agendas and they were going in different directions. And it was Paul who was bringing these people together and constantly coming up with, he had a tremendous gift with words, of course, but also a gift with concepts, in creating albums. And the last several albums, it was Paul most of the time who was doing the heavy lifting.
And also, before the meditation era, Paul was very open to every kind of avant-garde creativity. And John would have been happy to stay at home in the stockbroker belt doing nothing. But Paul was always saying, you've got to come up to London, you've got to see this, you've got to hear this music concrete. You know, music concrete, tape loops was on the Revolver album, you know, well before any sort of mysticism crept into their lives. And Paul, for all of the honours and all of the success that he has enjoyed, still slightly feels aggrieved that John is regarded as the avant-garde one, because Paul really was the avant-garde.
No, and because of John's martyrdom, as it were, you know, I think that changed a lot for Paul, because I think everybody felt, you know, that Paul wasn't, you know, good to the other members. And of course, Paul could be quite authoritarian in his own way. But, you know, I mean, if you read...
He knew he was right, and he usually was.
Hi. The album cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you know, it's a cover which has an iconic status. Luxuriantly rich, complex characters, and in fact the album cover is as iconic as the album itself. Now, how do you explain? And then came Rishikesh, and then the White Album was complete contrast. It was totally white. Now, how do you explain this total transformation from the earlier album cover to the White Album? What was it saying?
Well, the Sgt. Pepper cover was in the absolute sort of high tide of pop art in London, and the overall design came from Peter Blake and his then wife. But actually, the bass drum motif was Paul's father. Paul's father ran a little jazz band in Liverpool in the 1920s and 30s. And there is a photograph in the McCartney family album of Jim Mack's jazz band, as Paul's father's band was called, standing round exactly the same bass drum. And so that came from Paul. But all of those figures in the background were heroes of pop art, suddenly were cool and hip to have W.C. Fields and Laurel and Hardy and all Marlon Brando and all those people. It was absolutely the high tide of pop art. When they get to the White Album, it's minimalism, it's pure chaste white. They are absolutely what's going on in art as well as what's going on in music. And that was why there was this dimension to the Beatles as to no other band, because they cared about art and visuals as much as music.
And that was John, wasn't it? I mean, John was an artist as well. I mean,
John was, but John, again, so was Paul.
Yeah.
Paul was a caricaturist, a cartoonist, so was John. But it was always John who got the credit.
Okay.
John hung out with the arty crowd in Liverpool. Paul used to have to pretend. You wouldn't think Paul McCartney would ever have to pretend. Paul had to pretend to be at Liverpool University in those days.
and
give
even,
himself parity.
and even earlier than Sgt. Pepper's, you were speaking about how the album covers totally reinvented them into slightly left-bank intellectual figures.
Absolutely. The second album with the Beatles showed them. The first album cover was a traditional pop album of those days with some grinning lads looking down a stairwell in London. The second album, they looked like art students from the left bank. Half their faces were in shadow. They were wearing black polo necks. It was existentialism. It was artiness. And for the first time, an album cover was an art object. You could carry around a copy of that album and be cool. And again, that was something that they picked up in Hamburg because they met a young woman photographer called Astrid Kircher, who was a great photographer, who became engaged to Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the fifth Beatle, who tragically died of a brain hemorrhage in 1962, who was a brilliant artist more than a musician. So there was always that element of art and creativity and visuality in the Beatles that there was in no other band ever.
Mr. Norman, I have two questions for you. First one is, what was your first personal experience with the Beatles? And second, sort of classic question, which is your favorite Beatles album?
Well, the second one, I suppose, has to be John, because it was impossible not to adore John, however wayward he was, however badly he behaved, and he did behave badly, and he could be very unpleasant. But there is something eternally adorable about John Lennon. My first experience of the Beatles, I was working on a paper in East Anglia, a part of Britain that is only really known for its church history and the tradition of incest in its small villages on the fens. And I just thought, I'm so far away from everything that's happening here. How will I ever get to be in London around the Beatles? I can't, it's too late. I've left it too late. I hadn't left it too late.
Any other questions? Which album, Philip, before he also asked, which album do you like most of the Beatles?
Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul, there you are. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned Ringo as the runt of the litter. Despite that fact, he's outlived both John as well as George and looks younger than his son. So what's the...
That wasn't my... It was Walter Shenson, the producer of Help, who said that, to be fair, but I shouldn't have repeated it, perhaps.
So what would you recommend on reading up on Ringo?
Ringo was perfect for that time. It was a perfect formula. The way now people craft boy bands and girl bands with something for everyone in the lineup. That happened naturally. They got rid of their drummer Pete Best and they got Ringo in because they knew he would fit into the lineup perfectly. He didn't really have an education, but there was an awareness about Ringo, there was a natural wit about him, and a sort of common sense about him that was a kind of steadying factor. He was a bit of Liverpool that they took with them, like a lucky charm when they went around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, Ringo, is quite an amazing character who is loved by everybody. I mean, even Ravi Shankar really loved Ringo, and he mentions it. And you know, it's quite funny the way Ringo, poor chap, he had a terrible trip to India when they came, because you know, he had these inauguration shots before coming, and they were really paining him, and they took him to a government hospital here, where he was told to stand in the queue. For the first time, the Beatles for a long time came across bureaucracy. And then when he finally left for Rishikesh, that long, bumpy journey those days, his car kept on breaking down because he was traveling in these old ambassadors and he used to keep on heating up. And mind you, he was in such good humor still throughout. He gave an interview while going to Rishikesh to this Indian journalist, and he was full of beans. I mean, Ringo was up for anything.
Literally full of beans.
Literally full of beans.
Yes.
He was carrying one suitcase was of clothes and one suitcase was full of, you know, beans.
Yes. It's funny that people used to say that Ringo was not the best rock drummer in the world, and John said he's not the best rock drummer in the Beatles either. But that wasn't important. In fact, Pete Best wasn't such a bad drummer, but Pete didn't really fit. And Ringo just, if you look at it, there's a bit of old footage of the first time Ringo plays with the Beatles at the Cavern Club. And there is, they all look strangely short-haired and innocent. And people are screaming in the audience, "Where's Pete?" But what they're playing is an old R&B standard. It's called Some Other Guy. So,
we have time for just one last question, I think.
Let's take a question from right at the back. Anyone at the back with a question?
Yeah, there you are. One question.
Could you elaborate on how the Beatles exited India? As in, there's been talk of the Maharishi putting a curse on them.
Yeah. Black magic.
The Maharishi was dumbfounded by all accounts. I wasn't there. Because it came out of nowhere, really. It's kind of backstage rumors that go on sort of at pop concerts and, you know, at recording studios, suddenly sort of circulating around the ashram about the Maharishi. And John did go and quite unusually for John, he wouldn't go and confront someone like that.
Yeah.
But he did say, we're leaving. And the Maharishi said, why? You know, everything had seemed fine up to that point. And it was very untidy and unpleasant. But it did affect stayed with John as well.
Yes.
Even John.
Yeah, yeah. And I knew it was chaotic. It was shambolic, their departure, because Magic Alex was absolutely convinced that the Maharishi had put his jinx, and the cars kept breaking down. I mean, can you imagine? Their cars wouldn't move. And at one point, they found that John and Cynthia's car, just broke down, and it couldn't be repaired, and they had to take a lift actually in the middle of the Indian countryside. They were completely lost, and with Magic Alex constantly saying, "It's the Guru's black magic. It's the black magic." So it's an amazing, really, departure.
Ridiculous.
So I think we're done here. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid we do need to finish. Please join me in thanking